Okay, everybody. Last week I addressed how the Uranus-Pluto square alignment that's been operative since 2007 and will continue to be into 2021 using a 15-degree orb, which is the orb that Mundane astrologers use that has been noted to be active and operative historically, where those planetary alignments constellate most powerfully during those periods when those large, slow-moving planets move, and there is historic events that correlate, or a synchronistic relationship, if you will, of outer-planetary activations and historical events on the world stage during those periods. In this particular Uranus-Pluto alignment, we've seen a build-up or breakdown of planetary activations occurring on the world stage since 2007 and accelerating and intensifying as we move closer to the end of the decade. So let me do a little bit of review, and I'm going to be looking at all the questions that you'll post here, but I want to go over some review because I got a lot of questions from people who are new to this type of astrology. Many people are very aware of what personal or natal astrology can do and what transits and progressions mean. Many people out there just know astrology from a sun sign aspect of it, and that's their only familiarity. So this last lecture, the last presentation I gave on Facebook Live was very much an initiation for some out there. So I want to just do a little review, and I'm going to go a little deeper into it. I'm going to also talk about how we can use this information for some tangible benefit in your planning, in proactive planning, for how these alignments will likely manifest and impact your personal world. So Uranus, as you may know, or for those of you who are familiar with it, is archetypally associated with creativity, change that is rather impulsive and unpredictable in its expression. Uranus is also associated with shocking revelations and scientific breakthroughs, discovery of profound knowledge that ultimately emancipates, liberates, and awakens the masses. Uranus is very much connected with freedom, self-determination that goes against the establishment norms, and the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's also very much connected to youth and the new generation that has yet to find its voice and place in the world. Also, you may recall that I stated that Pluto represents the Plutonic archetype that's associated with the principle of power, death, and transformations that can be both destructive and creative. It's very much connected with the collective underworld of the erotic, the amatory, and the libidinal realm of the instinct, and it represents the collective will to power in the mythic psychospiritual death rebirth processes. As I stated last week, when these alignments occur and are combined, we see a sudden and unexpected activation of subterranean energy with collective unconscious eruptions on the world stage. A volcano, a literal, metaphorical, archetypal volcano, where the suppressed contents in the collective, in the global collective, spew its volcanic lava, its archetypal lava, is injected into the atmosphere and spread throughout the globe, right? So it's using that type of imaginary metaphor as seeing the Uranus-Pluto archetype, which is very much an activation of the subterranean energy of whatever is suppressed, denied, marginalized in the collective meaning the populace, the civilization of the world. And with the impulse of this Uranus-Pluto has very much to do with disrupting and overthrowing the status quo and the establishment with revolutionary force for the purpose of invoking deep changes within the collective and the culture respective to the institutions that control the collective. So essentially the Uranus-Pluto is very liberating and empowering in its outcome, in its effectiveness, in its result. Now, many people have asked me, William, this is the first time we're going through this Uranus-Pluto thing you're talking about. I mean, this seems to be a little bit, extreme and overly dramatic here in the way you're explaining it. And so let me just go back a minute and explain a little bit about the history of the Uranus-Pluto alignments, all right? Because once you get that perspective, then you'll realize what happened back then is very much playing out today on the world stage since 2007. So if we go back to the previous Uranus-Pluto alignment about 100 years ago, over 100 years ago, from 1845 to 1856, during the Uranus-Pluto conjunction, it corresponded to the Industrial Revolution, the Civil Rights Movement, the struggle for freedom and equality that culminated into the Civil War, right? The Uranus-Pluto opposition that occurred about 50 years later, from 1896 to 1907, corresponded to the rise of the middle class, the political populist movements, the women's political movement, the women's suffrage movement, the radical industrialization of civilization. We saw great scientific breakthroughs. We saw the rise of the electrical age, the rise of the petroleum era. All of that began, the rise of the railroad industries, and we saw the complete industrialization of the world, where the Industrial Revolution migrated from Europe to the United States and Japan during that period. So we saw dramatic shifts and changes occur in the very beginning of the 20th century. And during the Uranus-Pluto square alignment that followed around 30 years later, from 1929 up until 1939, 1940, we witnessed a breakdown and transformation of the global economy, with the result being the Great Depression. That peaked during the 4-day bank holiday and the Gold Confiscation Act, where people's money was confiscated by the government. We saw the rise of populist movements in Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan. We saw the rise of socialist movements in the United States. And the Uranus-Pluto, and this was followed around 30 years later with the Uranus-Pluto conjunction in 1963, started around 62, 63, into the early 70s. And that corresponded with the women's empowerment and liberation movement, the black civil rights movement, the gay liberation movement, the sudden and powerful emergence of the hippie counterculture movement, the struggle for freedom from colonial rule by the Third World, large-scale protests and major acts of civil disobedience, socialist movements from the New Left that would eventually infiltrate the Democratic Party in 1968 and continue onward, the rise of the counterculture and movements, social change movements such as flower power, free love, the sexual emancipation movement, the human potential movement. Anthony Robbins, for example, is who was born during the Uranus-Pluto alignment, during that Uranus-Pluto conjunction period, is a manifestation of the human potential movement in terms of what he represents now. You saw at that period the psychedelic movement, where the utilization of holotropic breath work, LSD psychotherapy, the use of psilocybin. And during that time, we saw massive leaps in the realm of the arts, in film. 2001, The Space Odyssey would be an example. In television, Star Trek would be an example of that. And in music, with the global phenomenon of Beatlemania. And also during that period, we saw a major breakthrough in the leaps in science, massive leaps of progress in science and technology with the microprocessor revolution, the computer revolution, the space race between the Soviet Union and the United States that led to the NASA moon landings. And during that period, we also witnessed radical political change, global social turmoil that was often followed by violent forms of revolution in many nations across the globe. So, it's clear, like right now, looking back and going forward, we can see that the Uranus-Pluto alignments have historically correlated with periods of social breakdown and the collapse of the old forms and structures as potent, libidinal, instinctual forces emerge from the very depths from within the collective that are stronger, more powerful than the existing power structure to contain it. So let me repeat that. The Uranus unleashes, accelerates, and intensifies the instinctual, repressed collective forces within the collective psyche of humanity. And when this volcanic archetypal volcanic force expresses itself through these planetary activations, or are synchronistic and symbolic with these planetary activations, we see them break apart the existing power structures, because the existing power structures, the social institutions, the governments, the establishment, the critics, the people, the oligarchy, the known and unknown aspects of government, everything that has to do with power, the power structure behind the power structure is no longer able to contain this new force. It can no longer reckon with this new force. So we have seen this happen in the past. We've started seeing it in 2007. I don't think anyone can argue with me or put up a plausible argument anymore that we are not in the place of massive radical change. And that change is not just happening in the world. It's affecting you. I know half the people here watching this, just looking at some of the names listed, were unemployed during this period, had to move away from the city they loved, was impacted in such a way their marriage didn't survive, or they had to made a drastic change in their job or career trajectory. All right? Many people decided not to get married. Many people decided not to have children. Many people decided to vote Republican instead of Democrat, or Democrat instead of Republican, depending on which election there was. But there was a radical shift in change. Many people went into therapy. Many people had a breakdown. Many people had a medical event that required some type of surgery or interventionary medical procedure. These are all ways that this can constellate. Now, since 2007, we have seen the latest activation of the Uranus-Pluto, witnessing the continued intensification and acceleration of social and political breakdown among nations throughout the globe. All right, let us not forget Arab Spring, when over 17 nations at the same time went into revolution. Let us not forget the breakdown of the Greek crisis, the breakdown in the Eurozone, the Euro crisis. All right, let's not forget what happened in Fukushima. Let's not forget what happened in the 2007 election, right? We saw an economic collapse that resulted in the election of Barack Obama, right? So we've seen since 2007 the acceleration of social, political breakdown among nations throughout the globe due to a weakening economic environment of bankruptcy, record bankruptcies 2007 all the way through 2010, monetary debasement, chronic high unemployment, massive underemployment rates, large-scale demonstrations throughout the globe, right? What was that? We forget so fast, Occupy Wall Street, right? Which became not just a local movement, but became a national and eventually an international movement. Nationwide strikes and riots in major cities, leading to increased polarization and political partisanship. There is more political partisanship now than there was at the height of the Bush administration. All right? And all of this is causing a continued political breakdown and in the democratic election process, and will ultimately lead, I believe, to a radical reconfiguration of the monetary system and the global power structure between now and 2020. Now, the figure who is going to lead this all right, is not going to be Elizabeth Warren. It's not going to be somebody, it's not going to be somebody you think you know. And that's exactly what I want to go to next, all right? The figure who is going to lead and set the Uranus-Pluto narrative for this reconfiguration event will be Donald Trump, will be President Trump, all right? Because Donald Trump represents the Uranus-Pluto archetype, his emergence, his black swan emergence into the political sphere that turned both the Republican and Democratic parties upside down, inside out, and basically shook up the electoral process is all symbolic of this Uranus-Pluto narrative. He set the agenda in 2016. He's setting the agenda now. He's challenging both the oligarchy and the government as it stands, all right? And basically, it comes down to this. Trump came to power during the Jupiter-Uranus-Pluto T-square alignment that began in the second half of 2016, in May 2016, right? When basically CNN called him Trumpzilla, right? With the image of him with Godzilla next to it, right? What's very interesting about that is the fact that the latest $200 million Godzilla film came out exactly during the Jupiter-Uranus-Pluto alignment in 2014, all right? In many ways, Trump acts like this massive, unstoppable disruptor, right? And this culmination of this Jupiter-Uranus T-square alignment that's been active from 2014 really constellated itself powerfully in 2016 and is manifesting fully, going full throttle with this upcoming eclipse in August 2017. So what I can say based on this without any reservation is the following months after the eclipse, from August into July next year, the U.S. in particular will be, and the world will be drawn into a convergence of crises of a great magnitude that will define the remainder of the 21st century. I am highly confident that's where we are moving. That's what you are sensing. That's why you cannot sleep so well at night. That's why you have tremendous level of angst. That's why you are so uncertain with everything. You go through periods of mania where you feel really good and you feel very depressed. All right, this bipolar type of collective disorder that's going on, that everyone has a tinge of to certain levels of extremes, with various extremes, is all representative of this Uranus-Pluto. Now, the reason I'm so sure about this is because Trump is unprecedented. He represents sort of the black swan. A black swan is an event that's highly improbable, almost unpredictable, that has a massive high-level impact intensity that changes the narrative and course of the future, all right? You could say, for example, 2007 in many ways was a black swan. I would say it was a gray swan because many people were out there, like Peter Schiff and many others, who were actually talking about that a major financial event was going to come of great magnitude, but we continue to ignore the obvious. We continue to ignore the obvious. And we'll get back to that in a minute, all right, because there's many gray swans out there, and the indicators are showing we have a massive black swan underneath that layer of gray swans that are sitting on top of it. Now, let's just talk back. Let's go further back in history. Let's go further back than the 1800s. Why? Because we are way overdue for an X event. A lot of people last week asked me, William, what's an X event? You sort of alluded to it, looked a little interesting. I looked it up, still couldn't get a grasp of it, so I'm going to explain it. I'm going to explain it in a very bottom line, straight to the point way. X events are events of massive high-level impact that will have historic significance, that changes the narrative and trajectory of history that is almost impossible to predict. Now, for example, the unprecedented, unexpected, swift collapse of the Soviet Union is an example of a minor X event, because the collapse of the Soviet Union did change the narrative for the end of the 20th century, and set in motion and made possible what the process of globalization. So that occurred during the Uranus-Neptune conjunction in late 91 and early 1992. However, what many people out there don't know, including many so-called mundane astrologers, is that since the 5th century onward, there have been consistent patterns of X events. And again, X events can be defined as unexpected major events that have changed the course of history, that have potent long-term global significance, that often occur during the second decade at the start of a new century. So it's the second decade at the start of a new century that these X events occur. And many of these game-changing historical events have often occurred in the middle part of that decade, all right? Let's say from like the 15 to 18 period. So going back, you know, to 1914 to 1918 was the First World War. Going back 1812 to 1819 was the Napoleonic War and the war between the U.S. and Great Britain, right? So we can see a period of during the mid-teen periods, the mid-teen and the second half of the teen period during the second decade of every new century. So I'm going to go through a list of them here. So we'll go all the way back, right? I'm going to just list them off. You can do the research yourself, but you will see in a second what I am talking about. So many of these game-changing historical events have often occurred in the middle part of the decade, and they correlated with the rise and fall of empires, large-scale military invasions, wars, revolts, social revolutions, the rise of a new leader that game-changed the course of history, the political power struggles, unexpected outcomes, religious conflicts, the outbreaks of major wars. There was also major innovations in government that occurred at that time. So let's just go back. As I mentioned earlier, 1914 was an X event. It was the Age of Revolution, World War I, 1914. Let's go back another 100 years. Age of Discovery, the French conquest of Europe, and invasion of Russia by Napoleonic armies. Then we go back another 100 years, Age of Discovery, the war of the Quadruple Alliance, and the Ottoman Empire Russian War of 1718. That was another big war. Then go back another 100 years during the Age of Discovery, the 30 Years' War in Europe that began in 1618. Then we go back to the Renaissance, and the Protestant Reformation began in 1517. That broke up the Catholic Church into many Protestant churches and resulted in a number of wars during that period. Then we had the later Middle Ages, which occurred with the 100 Years' War in 1450. And if we go back another 100 years, we have the Great European Famine in 1315. Many people don't know about this. The Great Famine of 1315 was a period marked by extreme levels of disease, mass death, cannibalism, infanticide. The crisis had consequences where the church nearly collapsed. European society nearly collapsed. It had massive future calamities that basically set the stage for the crisis that occurred in the second half of the 1300s. And then you had the if we go back another 100 years into the High Middle Ages, you had the Magna Carta was signed in 1215. We go back further another 100 years, the establishment of the Knights Templar. If we go back another 100 years, we see the Viking king Sven Forkbeard successfully launches a total invasion of England. England is conquered, and then he goes and invades France, and he goes on to invade Italy and Turkey successfully, all right? So nobody saw that coming in 1013, all right? So that's the type of X event that we're talking about. Let's go back another 100 years. Holy Roman Empire is established in the Kingdom of Germany, 912. Now another 100 years. Charlemagne rises up to power, takes over most of Western Europe for the first time since the Roman Empire collapsed in 814. Prior to the rise of Charlemagne, who nobody saw coming, Europe was in a complete dark age. Now let's go back another 100 years. The Muslims begin to invade Spain and attempt a full assault to conquer Europe in 711, and are pushed back. Another 100 years back, we see the rise of the first major dynasty and empire in China in 618. The Tang Dynasty is the first true dynasty that we understand China as today, as most of the aspects of Chinese culture come from that period. from the rise of that dynasty. And then if we go back another 100 years, we see the rise of Byzantium with the Justinian dynasty in 518. And then if we go back another 100 years, we see the complete collapse of the Roman Empire. On August 24th, 410, the Visigoths sacked Rome, which marks the ending of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Dark Age. So we just going back 100 years, every 100 years, in the second decade, usually in the second half of that second decade, we notice major events occur. Major events occur, and now it's clear from this historical trend, we are well overdue for some major X factor. This cycle, this X factor cycle, combined with the Uranus-Pluto alignment, all right, that's going to be active between now and 2020 tells me that we are on the verge of some type of titanic impulse of change, titanic impulse of intensity and power. We're on the precipice, all right, because Uranus-Pluto represents anything on a titanic scale. Titanic impulse for change, titanic impulse for power, titanic sense of defiance, titanic sense of struggle, all culminating during this X event cycle, all coming together, and it will express itself on this world stage. And I believe this summer it starts. Doesn't mean it's a one-day event, but it starts this summer with this eclipse coming up, and it will affect everyone in every way, in every sector on the world stage. Everyone in every way. And who's leading this? The Uranus-Pluto president, Donald Trump, whose chart will be activated by this upcoming eclipse on August 21st, conjunct his ascendant at 29 Leo, based on his birth record time, 8:54 a.m. All right, that's the time I'm using. That's the time I use using the black box technology to forecast his victory when 99% of the astrologers were predicting a Hillary victory. So when people say to me, oh, I'm going to predict what's going to happen to Trump, and they never saw him coming. They never predicted him. They never stayed. I'm going to tell you right now, would you hire that person right now? If they couldn't see the stock market crash or determine if that stock was ever going to be hot or not, and then they're going to tell you where the market's going to go next, would you listen to them? Would you continue to pay them? I don't think you would. But that's the problem right now. Most of the people out there are listening to these astrologers. They don't know nothing about X events. They know very little. They talk about Uranus-Pluto on a totally personal level. They don't understand it on a mundane level. They never saw the rise of Trump. They never saw the correlation, how Trump is the Uranus-Pluto candidate that they refuse to acknowledge. And they don't see how this is all traversing or converging with other larger cycles and this cycle here that I just talked about with this X event factor. All right? But it gets further. We can go further with this. This is all just review. All right? I'm just sort of answering the questions here to give some people review. All right? So what we're going to see is a collective level of volatile shifts in sentiment and mood combined with unpredictable and explosive episodes of hypomania and depression with the global populace. That is what's happening right now. All right? We're seeing extreme levels of hypomania and depression taking place, and we're seeing it in the mainstream corporate control media that serves its oligarchical masters. All right? CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, fake, phony, bread and circuses media. That's whole job is to keep you a compliant, tax-paying, hard-working, 40-hour-a-week consumer that spends beyond your means and continues to use credit cards to get you through the month. All right, because your salary continues to decline in purchasing power every time they keep manipulating the economy and extending and pretending the markets to the point and manipulating them to give you the impression that things are improving for everyone else when it's not for you. All right? That's what it really all comes down to. Now, I'm going to talk about the stock market in more detail in a few minutes here because a lot of people ask me about stock market and Bitcoin and this and that, and how does this big stuff you're all talking about really have an impact on my wallet, right? Well, we're going to talk about that right now. All right, because remember the 2007 bubble when Uranus-Pluto alignment began? Remember? All right, everyone said, I remember, I was there. I was writing about this on Facebook, and I had astrologers tell me, well, that wasn't a bubble. That wasn't really a big bubble because, or it's not a bubble. There's no stock market bubble because stocks were not as expensive as they've been in previous bubbles, such as 1999. So a lot of them would run various different analysis, PE ratio. They would look at price, all these different types of ratios, right? Price to earnings ratio is the classic. And using the price to earning ratio, it looked at the time that the stock market was not overvalued. In fact, it was modestly valued using these type of particular ratios. So everyone basically said that the big bubble in 2007 was nowhere reflective of the previous bubble of the 1999 tech bubble that imploded around the time of the August 1999 eclipse at 26-27 Leo, right? We're going to have an eclipse in August 21st at 28 degrees Leo. Interesting coincidence. Keep that in mind, because if you remember how it all turned out, the bubble burst began shortly after that eclipse, and by December 2007, on December 11th, I believe, the Federal Reserve basically provisioned the central banks, all right, for a major recession, all right, which led to the greatest financial crisis in 80 years by September or by the summer of 2008, all right? So I'm going to explain something to you now because it is clear to me today's bubble is way larger than the 2007 crisis, the 2007 bubble. So today's bubble is not only bigger than 2007, it's as big as the 1999 tech bubble, all right? And people continue to argue that stocks are cheaper than they were during the tech bubble isn't going to hold water if you basically use something that many analysts use but don't really talk about much, and that's the S&P's 500 price to sales ratio. So it's the price to sales ratio. It's called the PS ratio, all right? And based on this metric, the 2007 bubble is a mere blip, all right? Is a mere blip. And now we're in the territory of the 1999 bubble, all right? Because this is what's been going on. The Dow Jones Industrial hit a record high for the 23rd time all year, and just recently, closing around 21,500 points. And then from there, this has been a total of like about 120 days where the markets have continued closing up, reaching all-time highs, all right, for nearly, for nearly 20% of the time. All right, so stock prices, while the economy continues to decline, stock prices, while the economy continues to slow down, right? We're seeing major slowdowns in the economy, major slowdowns. They're always revising the GNP numbers. We're seeing the stock market continue to climb. So what's happening is stock prices are becoming completely disconnected from economic reality, and now we are facing one of the greatest bubbles of all time. See, here's the issue. The issue is a lot of people here listening to this don't buy into it. I'm going to tell you why. Because they're looking at the cash flow or the book value. They're looking at the price to cash flow, the price to book value. They're looking at the price to earnings value. But let me tell you something. All of these valuations can be rigged by the Wall Street elite. These people can rig those numbers, can make modifications to those numbers. What cannot be modified is the price to sales ratio. It's a valuation of the company's stock price to its revenues. The company's stock price to what that company actually earns. All right? So the sales are based on a company's revenue. All sales, whether it's a manufacturing company or service company, is based on a company's revenue. And they're impossible to gimmick. You can gimmick other numbers, but the one thing you can't gimmick without someone going to jail in the company, with the accounting, with the accountant, with the CFO, the CEO, all the people responsible for reporting these type of numbers, is the sales numbers. Either money came in the door, all right, in terms of sales or some type of revenue, or it didn't. And if the company is caught faking sales numbers, someone's going to jail. So the stocks right now are trading at a PS ratio that matches the tech bubble, and that tells us we're truly at astronomically exaggerated levels with basically the stocks are way overpriced. They're no longer matching the economy anymore, because basically what's happening is stocks, there's mergers. Look, 2016, it was a record level of mergers and acquisitions. Companies were buying up other companies. Those same companies that were buying up these other companies were then buying back their own stock. They would buy back that stock by going to the central banks, or going to the too big to fail banks, saying, "Hey, I need a loan to buy back my stock." They buy back the stock at 0% interest rates. The stock would go up. And then with that additional income from the stock, as the stock goes up, they could pay off those loans instantaneously with no interest, right? So that is basically happening, and it's continued to happen since 2016 with this Jupiter-Uranus-Pluto alignment that's culminating now to this eclipse. So the fact that we combine with increasing social, economic, political volatility characterized by this Uranus-Pluto alignment, and with the collective sentiment going from manic to depressive as we move forward into the solar eclipse, with these secular indicators, and the fact that the PS ratio now matches the tech bubble levels, where companies are not getting the level of sales. The value of the company goes up, the level of sales continue to decline. The S&P 500 goes up, the level of economic activity continues to decline. And when this is all culminating together, I believe we are coming to a crisis. Now the question becomes, how severe will it be? How long will it last? How will we get through it? Right? And, you know, it's just like 2008 in many ways. The summer of 2017 is very much like the summer of 2008. So, you know, you're going to see a major financial crisis is coming. It's coming, and it certainly indicates a crisis that cannot be paved over with money. They can't just pave this thing over. They can't keep interest rates zero. They have very little to do. The fact that the Fed said, we want to take all those toxic mortgages that we bought back in 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, up to 2014, when the Obama administration said the financial crisis was over, the recovery is here, and the central banks were basically buying bad, toxic instruments, putting it on its bank book, and now it wants to sell all these instruments, inject them back into the economy, then raise interest rates as the economy slows down, as the stock market is now artificially being propped up, is spelling to me financial crisis. This is exactly what happened in 2007, but the level of debt now is a millionfold greater, right? And the level of derivatives, financial instruments of mass destruction are all leveraging this type of debt that we have accrued. So they've taken all of this bad instruments, they're selling it back to the banks, all right, as collateralized debt or through some other form, or some other types of instruments, right? They're doing that right now. And while this is all happening, with the stock market at record high, housing near record high, interest rates near record lows, tax receipts down, money velocity at a near historic low, the economy stuck, going from bad to worse, the Federal Reserve continues to operate this way. Because the Federal Reserve is not about making sure the middle class continues to remain gainfully employed and moving up. It's basically to ensure the agenda of the oligarchy, which is to enhance the power and leverage of the 1% and suppress and deleverage the 99%, and you are the 99%. So the moment, the real issue is that the moment that the liquidity or the Ponzi scheme stops, that's when everything is going to go to fair value. Now, what do I mean by fair value? Real quick, there's no real price discovery. Your price of your home is not worth the price you think it is. You can argue with me, but it's real intrinsic value based on price discovery. What people are really willing to pay for that is very different than what the markup is. The same with stocks, the same with everything else. All right, and once this Ponzi scheme stops, once this Uranus-Pluto alignment disrupts the Ponzi scheme, the extended pretend policies that were set and put into place in 2008, it is essentially going to begin a major reset process, and that's when you're going to see everything go back to natural price discovery. Now, there's a lot of baby boomers out there. I talked on this last week. They were asking me about their pensions. All right, here's the issue. Many of the baby boomers, right, who were born 52 to 56, have this eclipse hitting their natal Pluto. According to Charles Jane, any eclipse hitting your Pluto is actually like an equivalent of a black swan event occurring in your personal life. So many of you baby boomers out there, look at your natal Pluto, natal Saturn. Do you have the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in late Leo? Then you really need to listen out here, because this is going to hit you in a very big way, especially in regards to your pensions. Because 6,100 baby boomers are retiring daily. 74 million baby boomers have retired since 2013. And most of the underfunded pension obligations have risen from 1.9 trillion, all right, to 292 trillion in 2007. All right, so 1.9 trillion, there was unfunded pension obligations, meaning there's pensions that people are not providing enough liquidity to, they're paying into, all right, and they're not performing. They're not performing as they were intended, all right. So these pensions are subperforming. They're subperforming, and they were subperforming at a level of 1.9 trillion. Now there's 292 trillion of underperforming pensions that are operative now. And the big problem with most of those pensions is that 50% of those pensions, all right, 90% of those pensions are holding over 50% of equities in them. So these pensions, 50% of what's in those pensions, what's in your pension, is composed of stocks. And remember, this is the second most expensive, or arguably the most expensive stock market in history. I'm going to go down saying this today. This is the most expensive stock market in history, bigger than the tech bubble, more expensive than the tech bubble. And 30% of those pensions are being held by the most expensive bond market in history with almost no cash in them. And 20% remaining is composed of illiquid, expensive commercial real estate and opaque leveraged derivatives. That's right, derivatives. So basically, they're all being backed by these derivatives. And that is basically the standard allocation of this of majority of the underfunded pensions out there. Now, as we know what's happening in Illinois. Illinois is the situation has gone from bad to catastrophic, and there's only one state in the union that has a fully funded pension. So, for example, what's happening in Illinois is not going to stay in Illinois, and this is all happening. This all started happening not yesterday, but during this Jupiter-Uranus-Pluto, where Illinois' financing continued to crumble due to rising cost levels throughout the state. All right, so the costs are rising, but the income levels are dropping. They're falling. All right, they're inverse. So the underfunded pension liabilities and health liabilities continue to increase, and the income of the state is declining. Sound familiar? Does this sound familiar in your state? Does this sound familiar with the United States? All right, and basically what has happened is that the credit rating has continued to be lower, costing the state more and more money to borrow, and therefore its level of debt has dramatically risen. So here's the point. The point is, at some point, the rubber hits the road. And according to the planetary alignments, the rubber is hitting the road sooner rather than later. Sooner rather than later. All right. So basically, that's the core of what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to say something about Bitcoin. I don't really see a major decline in Bitcoin. I told everyone, look, Bitcoin's going to go through a lot of variations, right? Bitcoin is up 10%. All right, it took a big setback, but it resurged back very strongly. And Bitcoin and all these other virtual currencies really rally back really well. There doesn't seem to be any sense. People don't know where to put their money worldwide, all right? And what they're putting in is Bitcoin. People are sensing the urgency. They're sensing the urgency. So I'm going to look at some of your questions here. Okay. Yeah, the Saturn Pluto generation were born 47 to 49, 1952 Cardinal Square Cross. Yeah, so it's really those folks from 52 to 56, especially with those who have Pluto in late Leo, that really do need at this point to get a very serious look at their financials. They need to get a depression defense consultation by someone to make sure they can survive the hit, because the hit is coming, all right? The hit is coming. All right, so I'll stay on for a few minutes longer, and I know I started a little late, so Lori mentioned here, many banks cannot collect large amounts of student loans. When loans were transferred, all records got lost. Courts will not allow creditors to collect. Yeah, so we're going to see a lot of defaults. Many defaults are coming into place. Look, we have Puerto Rico default. Illinois is going to default. New Jersey's next on the list. For those of you in New Jersey who think your pension is safe, who think your state finances are sound, all right, that think your local municipal banks are secure, who have pensions that connect up with municipalities that's backed by the state, you're in serious trouble. Serious trouble is brewing. So we see that situation. And one of the other situations I wanted to talk about real quick was the fact that we're seeing a breakdown with the Chinese economy. The Chinese economy is in even more serious trouble than the American economy. So look to China as the poster child of what's happening. Illinois is the poster child for the level of debt implosion that we can expect to come, especially when we see a lot of gyrations occurring in the markets. And again, part of this, dark night of the soul process, right, which is the season, the economic season and cycle we're in, is very much about dying into life. And in that dying into life, we discover the larger cosmic community. We discover how we're connected to something greater than ourselves, and many people during this time need to find a container to cultivate and hold some type of vision or heroic vision of the great good that is radically different, they need to hold some type of vision to get through this. One of the things is, as you're affected by this, you'll see how radically different you are from those who continue to participate in the values and beliefs of mainstream culture. So going through this period, this dark night of soul takes a kind of heroic allegiance to individuate through this struggle, right, through this titanic struggle, much like we saw, like we've seen in the Bible, like we've seen in many types of stories, in many of the myths. So we're gonna see a lot of this play out, and we're seeing it definitively play out with the financial system and with the political system. Yeah, so someone's asking me about the housing market. I believe the housing market is peaking right now. I'm going to present more data on that. You'll have to take my word for the moment, but I'm going to present some very compelling graphs from all the different markets, at least from the largest cities in the United States. So I believe the housing market is peaking. There's a bubble going on. I don't see how that's going to continue. All right. Yes, Chantel said, this is a lot to digest. Is it being recorded? Yes, it's being recorded. Justine asks, does the eclipse hit the New York City chart hard or the Fed? Well, I didn't look at that yet. That's I'm doing an eclipse. Just asked, yes, New York Stock Exchange. Yes, we have multiple New York Stock Exchange charts. That's really the bigger issue here. All right, the bigger issue is that. What it is hitting, all right, for a fact, is the horoscope, the horoscope of the day the 2009 bull market began. All right, so what I took notice in my upcoming Eclipse seminar that I'm going to go into with the riveting details of how I think this is going to play out. Very riveting details from the geopolitical, economic, with the housing market, etc. Which cities are going to hit worse in terms of the intensity level. But what I notice, and I'll give out freely here today, is the fact that the bull market, all right, the bull market began in March. I believe it was March 9th. I don't have the exact date in front of me, but the bull market began in 2009 in March, and the moon for that bull market, when the stock market opened on that day on Wall Street, was at 28 degrees of Leo. So the eclipse, the upcoming eclipse, is going to hit the moon of the 34th bull market, and that bull market has been running, going unabated from that point up till now. So it is an indication we will see a major unprecedented reversal, most likely from some type of secular event that will disrupt it. Some people, I'm just reading some questions here. Yeah, a black swan event such as a health crisis could be an epidemic. So, for example, the Great European Famine was crop failure. That was an ecological crisis. Another black swan event was the Black Death that occurred a short time after in 1348, where we saw a major epidemic of the bubonic plague, right? In 1918, we saw what? We saw another epidemic that actually killed more people than the entire casualties, military and domestic casualties of World War I, and that was it was a flu epidemic. There was a flu that occurred from 1914 to 1918 that actually killed more people than the entire First World War, and it started, by the way, in the United States. It started in the United States. So that's another way a black swan event, something that's almost impossible to predict, that's highly improbable, but if it were to occur, it would change everything. It would turn the whole world upside down, inside out. The whole astrological worldview of 90% of the astrologers would collapse instantaneously. All right, that's what I predict is coming. All right, Trump, in a way, could be argued to be a black swan. I would say he was more of a gray swan, where we knew some populist candidate who had the financial means, the political acumen, and the ability and means to convince the larger populace that he means to take action and say and act on what he believes, all right, to serve their interest, the 99%, could be president. We talked about it almost happened with Ross Perot, right, until they got to him, and they weren't effective at neutralizing Trump, right, and now they're trying to politically destroy him. Now the argument is being made by many people other than myself that we are going to see that the Fed and the oligarchy will try to destroy Trump politically, destroy his political agenda and means to achieve his outcomes through imploding the economy. Now, the difference is between Trump and Obama is Trump has already articulated that he is willing to push the red button and default on all the debt. However, that would mean for most baby boomers out there that 50% of your retirement will not be available. So you'll get a check, but it'll be 50% of what you're expecting. Okay? And that is political. That is something that probably Trump would consider doing, knowing his temperament, his history. So I believe that is on the board. That's something, that's a black swan event. People would say the U.S. will never default on the debt, and here's the reasons why. The moment some expert continues to tell you this is what's not going to happen for sure, you know that's what's going to happen. All right. So when someone says that could happen, that ain't going to happen. It's what they tell you is never going to happen, can't happen, won't happen. If you would have said to somebody in the military-industrial complex that North Korea would have a fully operational ICBM that could hit Anchorage, Alaska within 10 years or less, all right, they would have laughed at you. And that's exactly what just happened a few weeks ago. And right now, the North Koreans say they have miniaturized a nuclear warhead. They miniaturized the nuclear warhead to fit on an next ICBM launch. All right. Now you have to realize the level of technology to build an ICBM is even far more sophisticated than to building a crude nuclear device. But then to shrink, to compress that nuclear device where it's a fissionable weapon on a missile that can be that could be launched, all right, and hit a target accurately, required a level of major technological leaps and bounds. Now that tells me either the North Koreans are extremely innovative or they're getting a lot of help. And the question is who they're getting the help from. And I think we all know who the North Koreans are getting their help from. All right, and this is part of what the emerging geopolitical crisis is about. All right, and it's not totally centered just on North Korea. I believe we got a lot. There's going to be a lot of blowback coming in the Middle East as well. But this is all what is converging. So we're going to see a convergence of an economic crisis, a geopolitical crisis, and an ecological crisis, probably related to the weather, the global cooling, or we're going to see massive gyrations in weather, right? Or there's going to be colony collapse disorder happening with the bees that will accelerate to the point where plausible deniability is gone. Or, we don't know, and probably there are a bunch of scientists who do know what's happening, but they're not in a position to inform the public on it. It could be also something bigger than that, all right? And you know where I'm going with that, right? So it could be part of a disclosure event. So there is something big coming. And you got to understand that we need to sort of go through this process. We're going to have to go through the breakdown to get through the breakthrough, all right? And generally, during these periods when civilization undergoes this collective rite of passage in the past, we saw a crisis of meaning, all right? There's this like direct encounter with our collective mortality, a sense of losing stability, a sense of losing our center, a sense of collective madness, like what I've termed like this neurotic bipolar disorder, right? That we're seeing, where companies know that their profit margins keep thinning no matter how much they optimize, automate, or use enterprise first generation artificial intelligence systems. They still aren't able to make the level of profit they need to be sustainable. So this is not only happening with small companies, medium-sized companies, it's happening to countries, it's happening to banks, all right? And so this is all part of this bigger process that's taking place. All right, so I don't know if there's any more final questions. Oh, I'm seeing a whole bunch of other questions popping up all over the place. Yes, 1918 flu started from vaccines. I can't confirm that. Yes, so someone asked me, will there be a new renaissance? Usually with psychospiritual death, rebirth, transformations, the rebirth implies a renaissance to follow. So yes, there is good news at the end of the tunnel. The light at the end of the tunnel is there will be a major reconfiguration of civilization, of humanity, a redefinition of who we are, all right? We did not come from Adam and Eve. The Darwin evolution hypothesis will be completely destroyed and eradicated once and for all. We're going to find out more information that's very much going to redefine who we are, all right, and who we're related to, who we're connected to. And it's not just on a biological level, but I think on a spiritual level as well. I'm not the first one to bring this up. This is the Mayans talk about this, and many other indigenous cultures that have their own prophecy, shamanistic prophecy that goes back thousands of years, have talked about this period being very much about that. Okay. Yeah, so I'll talk about Social Security another time. Russia is teaching North Korea. No, I think China is behind North Korea. I think we're going to really find out our real enemy is not Russia. Our real enemy is China. All right, China represents a bigger threat to Russia. All right, because should China reach full military parity with Russia, technological parity with Russia, it's already surpassed Russia economically. It would be able to eat Russia for lunch easily. It's willing to take. It's got a massive population. It could put 100 million men out in the field. It's developing a blue ocean navy. They've got nuclear weapons. They're now building space-based platforms. They have already plans to have a base on the moon and plan to go and beat the United States going to Mars. They say what they mean and they mean what they say. Like we used to be, they have become. Let me tell you something. China is the problem. The existential threat to the United States, really, long-term, is China, not Russia, all right? And that is something that we have to rethink very hard about. And at some point, historically, if you go back in time, there is always a power struggle to which civilization will dominate in that era. And we're now we're hitting the precipice point of where at one point China is no longer going to back down, no longer play along, no longer going to listen, no longer play second fiddle to the United States. That already has begun. That already has begun. All right. Yeah, many people feel like a scarf in the wind. They feel shaky. They feel powerless. But remember, you are the resistance. You set the narrative for the future. You have a say. The fact that you're here, the fact that you agreed to be here, the fact that your soul's code and calling, part of your soul contract stated, I want to be here with this transformation. I want to contribute to this. So you're either going to get in the way of it, or you're going to be somehow a mouthpiece, you're going to be a device, you're going to be a means, right? You're going to somehow play a part. So don't stay at home, watch fake news, freak out on Facebook, and eat junk food. Don't do that and get fat. Don't do that. Take action. Just make a choice. You know, you can't have your feet in one world and have your feet in the other. You can't sort of like, play it both ways. You can't continue to do this, right? You're going to have to make a decision sooner rather than later. And many times, for people who don't make a decision and remain passive voyeurs, a decision will be made for them. And time is running out. Time is running out. Your options to keep all your everything open on the table is coming to an end. It's just going to. You'll see what I mean. You'll see what I mean later in the year. All right? And many of the concepts that many people, not particularly most of you here, because I have an idea, I've exchanged with you over the years, but many people who think when is it all going to go back to normal? It's not going to go back to normal. Normal won't be something that will really have much relevance of meaning for a good, at least for until the beginning of at the end of the next decade. I would suspect probably the late 2020s, will we have any sense of normalcy? Just like the people who went through the 30s and 40s didn't have a sense of normalcy until around the 50s. And then by 63, everything got turned upside down again. So, normal, going back to the normal, whatever that means, is just a passé way of thinking. All right. Karen stating, I'm seeing many people, including myself, redefining themselves as individuals, completely changing their lives. Absolutely. Like I stated earlier, an existential crisis, no matter on what level, always fundamentally changes your values, your beliefs, your goals, your sense of purpose, and living and forces you to live a life of meaning and purpose, where status, acquisition, professional upward mobility all really becomes take a second or tertiary role in our lives, or completely eliminate it when we go through these type of periods that Karen just explained she's going through and is still in process with. All right. All right. So I think 7:20, we're going to stop it there. I want to thank you all for coming. I really enjoy your questions. Next week, I'm not going to do a review. I'm going to go into new material, but this was to give you a better idea. We're going to go through a convergence of an X event. We're going to have this Uranus-Pluto. Then we have the Saturn-Pluto, which I'm going to talk about next week. All right. And that has very much with the dystopian theme that I want to bring in. I'm going to talk about some dystopian movies that were made over the past 50 years, that many of the dystopian themes in those movies that were made during Saturn-Pluto alignments are going to be reconstellated with this new upcoming Saturn-Pluto alignment. And you're going to see many of the issues that were talked about in the movie are now front and center, mainstream issues that we're now dealing with. They're not like science fiction anymore. All right? They're things that are like real, and we're going to have to confront, and we're going to have to find a way through these intractable problems. All right? So we're going to have to find solutions, not fixes, but solutions. And one of the things I just want to say about what's happening in Washington is the fact that all bills being pushed through right now that are not solution-based bills, but just fixes to a flawed program or a flawed system, or, is going to fail. It's going to fail. It's not going to get passed. It's going to fall. You're going to see a lot more happen this year, not just with Obamacare. You're going to see it with many other things in terms of getting the budget. Anything that tries to continue the extend and pretend, unsustainable, untenable structure, the way we're doing our budget, the way we're dealing with resources, is all going to pretty much fall through. All right. And then next week, I want to really talk about the deep state, because there's one astrologer in particular. I'm not going to name names, but really has gone out of a way to really state that the deep state is some type of projection fantasy that has nothing to do with the reality. All right. And does not justify anything that's going on in our real world. Well, we're going to straighten that out. I'm going to go into the deep state, what it is, why you should know about it, and how this country financially is imploding because of the black budget, because of the deep state structure, because of the decisions in 1948 and 1963, right? We remember what happened in 63, okay? So all of those things are now culminating. I want to talk about that. So next week's going to be a deep state talk. I'm going to just unleash really hard, because we still have astrologers out there. We still have people who still believe in 8th grade civics class of Democrats and Republicans, and this is a fully operational, freely functional democratic republic. That is so far from the truth, all right? And I think you intuitively know that. But I'm going to prove that out once and for all, that this idea of a deep state does not exist. We're going to eliminate that. All right, and we're going to straighten that out. All right, and this is all going to be related astrologically. I'm going to prove it out astrologically. I'm going to prove it out historically. And I'm going to prove it out with the secular evidence. All right, but in the meantime, watch what's going on with the markets. Look up the look up the sales to ratio index. Look that up. Look it up for yourself, because they can't fake the sales, folks. They can fake everything else, but if money isn't coming in the door, they can't fake that. It's the one thing. And when you actually run it, you realize they're not selling anything, because you're not buying, because you don't have the money. And if you had the money, you're not parting with it. So that's what you need to think about. Think about that really hard, all right, before you call your know-it-all brother-in-law who knows everything about the stock market and says your money's safe, or your broker who keeps collecting money even though you took a big hit in 2008. You think about that really hard, all right, because things are going to change. All right. On that note, I'm going to stop here, and I want to thank you all for coming and keep giving me feedback, and hopefully I'll keep improving my approach, and we'll get better at this. And I want to thank you all for what's happening here. Okay, Tuesday, 6 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time, same bat time, same bat channel.